so if you did miss the last couple weeks going through Mark chapter 13, I would highly recommend you can go and check out the podcast on iTunes and catch it. Also, we have the video on our YouTube channel because to understand this passage we're looking at today, you kind of have to get what Jesus has been talking about leading up to this. So to catch up to speed a little bit, last time we were in Mark 13, which was last year was our 1-year birthday, so it was 2 weeks ago. This section ended with Jesus saying that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And all these things Jesus had talked about up until that point in time was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And after Jesus said this generation is not going to pass till all these things come to pass, in verse 28 through 31, Jesus gave a parable of a fig tree shedding its leaves, which was a prophetic picture that the temple was going to be destroyed because it was not bearing fruit. But then Jesus said, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, hey, but don't worry, the spring's coming, and even after the fig dies, there's going to be new fruit. Jesus was saying that after the temple's destroyed, God had a plan to bring new life and a new way of life by which the people of God would interact with God. You no longer had to go into a temple to come into the presence of God, but God's presence would no longer dwell there. His presence would dwell in his people. We would bear and carry the presence of God through the Holy Spirit. So that's what we've kind of looked at in the past couple of weeks. And again, to understand this, at the beginning of the Olivet Discourse, we need to remember that Jesus' disciples had asked him 2 questions. So all of Mark 13 is in the context of 2 questions the disciples asked him, which is number 1, when is the destruction of the temple going to happen? When are these things going to come to pass? And then the second question that they asked is concerning his second coming. And we see this in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, if you want to just look there real quick. But this is the question the disciples asked him. They said, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be? And before this, Jesus had just talked about the destruction of Jerusalem. So these things being, when is the temple going to be destroyed? And second question, what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? So these are the 2 main questions Jesus is addressing. When will the destruction of the temple happen? And when will your coming at the end of the age be? And as we've looked at verses 1 all the way through verse 31, that was Jesus' answer to their first question. Jesus said, this generation is not going to pass till all these things happen. And as we talked about a few weeks ago, they did witness it. Exactly everything Jesus talked about up to this point in time, they saw it with their very own eyes. That generation did not pass away until those things were fulfilled. But now, starting in verse 32, Jesus shifts to begin to answer their second question, which is the question concerning his second coming. So look down with me, if you would, at verse 32. It says this, but concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. As Jesus in verse 32 here starts to transition from talking about the destruction of the temple to his second coming, we know that because of a few key clues we see here in the text. First off, this phrase in verse 32, but concerning. In the Greek language, this is the Greek phrase de peri, which sounds more French to Greek than me, but it is Greek. And this phrase, but concerning, in the Greek language, it indicates a strong change in subject. This is a Greek way of starting a new idea. And we don't just see Jesus using this here in the text, but even if you read the epistles that Paul wrote over and over and over again, Paul will use this exact same phrase, but concerning, when he is transitioning from one subject to another. For example, at the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul was talking about sexual immorality in chapter 6. At the beginning of chapter 7 and verse 1, he says, but concerning, and then he changes subject to begin to talk about marriage. At the end of chapter 7, when he's done talking about marriage, right at the beginning of chapter 8, verse 1, he says, but concerning, because he changes the subject from talking about marriage to food that was sacrificed to idols. Same thing happens at the beginning of chapter 12 of 1 Corinthians. He was talking about the Lord's Supper in chapter 11, and chapter 12 opens with, but concerning, and he begins to talk about spiritual gifts, a completely different subject. One more in chapter 16 of 1 Corinthians, again in verse 1, Jesus was talking about the resurrection in chapter 15, and he says, but concerning, and then begins to talk about the money that he was collecting to give as a donation to the church of Jerusalem. So if you are a first century Jew, that phrase, but concerning, you understand, is a strong indication that the subject matter matter is changing. Not only that, though, not only is that textual evidence that that Jesus is shifting the conversation from destruction of Jerusalem to now the second coming, but also there's an important grammatical shift here used when Jesus says, but concerning, notice, he says concerning that day or that hour. It's important to note that up to this point in time, when Jesus has been talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, he has referred to it as those days, plural. We see this in verse 19 of the passage. We see it in verse 24. As Jesus has talked about the destruction of Jerusalem, which was their first question, he talks about it as those days. There is now an intentional shift here where Jesus is not talking about those days in general with all the events leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. He is now talking about that day, that hour, singular, to again answer their second question about the day of his return, the day of his second coming. And what he says is this, concerning, change of subject, that day, he says, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So that day, and that hour of which nobody knows, this is a common phrase, again, used all throughout the Old Testament and New Testament to talk about what is known as the day of Yahweh or the day of the Lord. And this idea of the day of the Lord, again, it's a common thread in the Old Testament and New Testament concerning the second coming of Jesus. If you read through the scriptures, you'll see over and over and over this common theme of that day, that hour. It's all speaking of the day of the Lord. A few examples of this, I'll just throw at you. Matthew chapter 7, for example, verse 22 and 23. Listen to what Jesus says there. He says, on that day, a singular event, on that day, many will come to me and say, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. He says, on that day, the final day when he comes back, there's going to be people who are like, look at all we did. And Jesus says, but I never knew you. It wasn't about what you did. It was to know you, to have a relationship with you. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 8, Paul the apostle writes this, henceforth, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to those who have loved his appearing. So Paul says, on that day that Jesus comes back, the second coming, he will give to those who loved his appearing, who were awaiting his appearing, the crown of righteousness. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 12 and 13, Paul writes this, now if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. So Paul is saying here, on that day, the day that Jesus comes back, his second coming, all of our works are going to be tested by fire. And anything that was pure, anything that was from our heart, we actually did as an act of worship to God, it will be preserved. And he says, and everything else, it's not going to last. It's going to be like wood and hay and straw that will just burn and will have no benefits towards eternity. So that day, to put it shortly, as you see Jesus, you're talking about that day, that hour, all throughout the New Testament and Old Testament, that day, in short, is shorthand for the end goal and the end drama of human history. That's what that day is. And the day of the Lord is actually not just one thing that happens, which is Jesus coming back, but the day of the Lord is primarily four things that happen all simultaneously on that day. If you're a note taker, this could be helpful to write down. The day of the Lord in the New Testament is used speaking of four different things that all happen at the time of Jesus' second coming. The first aspect to that day or the day of the Lord is, as we talked about, the second coming of Jesus. That is the return of the Messiah, that on that day, which no one knows, we are going to see Jesus coming back from heaven in human form. Jesus will come and appear, and all will see him. Secondly, that day does not only refer to Jesus coming back, but it also, on that day, is going to happen the resurrection of the dead. We see this in the New Testament. That day speaks of his coming, also resurrection. That everyone who has died and everyone eventually will die will be resurrected on that day at the second coming of Jesus. The righteous resurrected to life and the wicked resurrected to destruction. The resurrection is a part of that day, the return of Jesus. Third, that day, the day of the Lord, also does include aspects of judgment when God comes and puts the world right again. And I know that this is something that is politically incorrect probably to talk about in church, and a lot of people probably do have a lot of past hurts on church that like were super like guilt trippy and like judgment and stuff like that. But we don't have to be scared of the reality that on that day there is judgment, because here's the reality. As politically incorrect as it is to talk about judgment, this is something that we are all craving. Like, whether we know it or not, we are all longing for a God who will one day show up and set the world straight and bring an evil to injustice and to evil and to oppression. I'm so thankful that we serve a God who is just, who isn't just like, oh, look at all the evil and horrible and atrocities you've committed. It's cool. You're good to go. Like, that would be an evil judge. If you think of somebody who went and did a mass shooting or something, and they stand before the judge and he's just like, oh, whatever, like it's not a big deal. Like, we would be like, that is evil. Like, how could you allow that? On the day of Yahweh, the return of Jesus, the second coming, it will be a day of judgment. But the judgment is God setting the world into the way it was supposed to be, restoring and reconciling all things. Judgment is actually a beautiful thing. It is the destruction of evil. It is an end to sin and an end to brokenness. And so that is an aspect of the day of the Lord, that it will be the final judgment where there's the separation of the sheep and the goats. You can read those parables that Jesus talks about. And then fourth and finally, the day of the Lord also speaks of the healing of the cosmos, also known as new heavens and new earth. So the day of the Lord is Jesus will return. There will be a physical resurrection of all people who have ever walked the face of the earth. There will be a judgment. We will stand before God and we will give an account for our lives. And then God will restore all things and make all things right. There will be a new heavens and a new earth. And what Jesus says here in verse 32 is concerning that day and that hour which all of this happens. He comes, resurrection, judgment, healing of the nations, new heavens, new earth. Concerning that day and the hour, he says, nobody knows, not even the angels in heaven or the Son himself. And it's really important to understand that Jesus is saying, nobody knows. And the reason we got to get that is because there have been so many Christians even throughout history who have thought like, well, yeah, but I do know. Like, I have received this like special revelation and have read like what's happening in the news, and I'm predicting like that this is going to be the day or the hour that it happens. And it's just foolish to do that. Like there have been lots of people who actually love Jesus and are great Bible teachers who have tried to predict the exact day and the exact hour that Jesus came back, and they've even written books, and those books are taken off the shelves once that day passes. So all that's to say, like, that's not our job to try to predict when that's going to happen, because Jesus said nobody knows. And included in that nobody knowing, if you notice, is not only that none of us know or the angels, he also says in verse 32, nor the Son, but only the Father. So this for some people could be kind of confusing. Wait, the day that Jesus comes back is a day that he doesn't even know? That seems kind of weird, because I thought Jesus was God. And if Jesus is God, I thought God knows everything, so how could he not know this about his own life, right? Like it kind of is confusing for some people, and that's okay. It's kind of mysterious. But what Jesus is getting at here, the reason that he doesn't know even the day or the hour of his own return, only the Father, is that because when Jesus became a human in the incarnation, he actually became fully human. This is what we have to get. A lot of people don't understand exactly what happened in the incarnation. When Jesus, God the Creator, took on flesh like us, he became fully human, not kind of human, or he was just sort of human, or a different species of human, or a fake human. No, Jesus, in the same way that you are fully human, he actually became fully human. And in doing so, he, of his own volition, set aside the right to his divine attributes. It's not that he didn't possess them. It's not that he no longer was God. He set aside the rights of his divinity. And Paul the Apostle makes this very clear in Philippians chapter 2. Philippians 2, verse 6 and 7. Listen to what Paul writes here. He says, who though he was in the form of God, that is Jesus, he was in the form of God, he didn't count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Although he was equal with God, he didn't cling to it. He didn't grasp it and hold on to it. I'm God, I can do whatever I want. He didn't count that a thing to be grasped. He didn't hold on to it. It says, but rather he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. So when Jesus came in the flesh, he did not cease to be God. He still possessed his divinity. However, he set aside his rights to divinity by taking the form of a bondservant and coming to earth as a full human being. Now, in doing so, there are many things that Jesus could not do as a human being because of him choosing to not grasp and hold on to his rights of divinity. For example, God is omnipotent, which means God is all-powerful. There's nothing that God can't do. But if we look at the life of Jesus, check this out. There are certain things that Jesus could not do. As a human being, he could not live, he could not function without normal food and normal sleep, just like any other human. We see in the Gospels that after Jesus was flogged and beaten before they sent him to be crucified, that Jesus was so physically drained of energy and had probably lost so much blood, he could not even carry his own cross anymore. And so they had to compel a bystander, Simon the Cyrene, to carry his cross for him. Wait, I thought God's all powerful. Couldn't Jesus just have done that? He was fully human. And in being fully human, he chose to set that aside. God is omnipresent, which means there's no place in the world, there's no place in heaven or on earth where God is not. The psalmist makes this very clear. If I ascend into heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you're there. There's nowhere on this earth that we can flee from your presence. God is everywhere at every moment of time. But such was not the case with Jesus when Jesus became a human. Jesus was not everywhere at every moment of time. In his humanity, he was bound and limited to only be one place at one time. Does that make him any less God? No. It is showing the fullness of his humanity, that he laid aside the right to be omnipresent, which is why he needed to make disciples and send them out, which is what we looked at last week. He sent them out to all these other towns because Jesus couldn't be everywhere at every time to preach the gospel to everyone, which is why he said, hey, go make disciples. We are a part of the commission and the call of that. God is omniscient, which means there's nothing that God doesn't know. Which, by the way, that is so encouraging to know that when I'm coming to God, like, he already knows everything about me. He already knows what I'm struggling with. He already knows my sin that I'm trying to hide. He already knows it, and he already took it on the cross. And so we don't need to try and hide stuff from God. He already knows it. But although God knows everything, there's nothing he doesn't know. Jesus, as an infant, grew up just like every single one of us as a human growing up from infancy. And I don't know if you know this, but babies don't really know that much, right? Like, I got 2 of them right now, and they're just kind of figuring a couple things out. They don't really know a whole lot. When Jesus was growing as a child, he didn't know everything. He wasn't born like knowing how to read and write and do mathematics and like, he just like all of us as a normal human, he grew in his knowledge and understanding as a normal human being because he was fully human. We see all the time in Jesus' ministry, he was asking questions. At the age of 12, he was in the temple reasoning and asking questions. He was learning just as any other human learns. And so this is, again, the beautiful thing, that this is not a lower view of God. To say that Jesus was fully human is not a lower view of God. It's actually a higher Christology. It's to understand what actually happened in the incarnation, that God himself was making himself a human to be accessible to other human beings. This is such a beautiful thing, that we serve a God not who is just so transcendent and whoa, he's some floating being up in the clouds. No, he's actually human. He knows the brokenness that we experience as humans. He knows the hardship. He knows the suffering. He knows sadness. He knows anger. He knows everything that we know as human beings. It's a God who is accessible and a God who is approachable, a God who is fully human. And yet, at the same time, although he is fully human, we know that Jesus also was divine. That he actually was the fullness of God. Jesus is one person with two natures. If you want to throw out a cool word at a dinner party or when you're at coffee with someone and you're on a date and you're trying to impress them with the theology, you can be like, hey, do you know anything about the hypostatic union? And they'll be like, no, because no one does. And you're like, it means that Jesus was fully God and fully man. And that's not something in my fully human brain I can fully get my mind around, but it shows, if anything, I love that I can't fully understand how that works. That Jesus was one person with two natures, fully God and yet fully man, and yet that is the mystery of what we see in the scriptures. When Jesus came to this earth, he maintained his divinity, but he added to it humanity. However, he did not count his equality with God a thing to be grasped. He emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, and in his humanity, being fully human, there were certain things that he did not know, and this is one of them. Concerning the second coming, the day and the moment he will come back, he does not know that. And this is really important for us just as a moment to pause and reflect. We need to understand that there are so many people who just kind of go towards one extreme view of Jesus or the other. There are some people who see Jesus as only God, and he is fully God. But if you only see Jesus as only God and you don't understand his humanity in the incarnation, he seems too transcendent, for me to even know or be able to have some sort of personal relationship with. And there's other people who say, Jesus, yes, he was human, he was fully human, but they don't see his divinity. And they're like, oh, he was just human, he was just like any other one of us, and the playing field is even. But what we need to understand is that when we look at Jesus, we have to look through both lenses. We have to see him for his divinity, that he is holy and that he is righteous and that he dwells in inapproachable light, and yet at the same time, that he came to show us he is approachable, that he took on humanity in the incarnation so that we could have access to him and so that we could have a relationship with him. And to view Jesus through only one of those two lenses is to have an incomplete picture of who he actually was. And so maybe that's just a moment of challenge for you to say, what lens are you prone to look at Jesus through? Do you only see him as God and you're scared to come to him because you're like, whoa, he's just too righteous and holy and powerful and I'm so broken, there's no way I could come to him? And if that's the way you're seeing God, you need to look at his humanity and see, wow, he is approachable. Or maybe you're here and you're like, yeah, he's approachable, he's Jesus, he's a human, but you've lost the understanding of his majesty and his glory and how powerful he actually is, and that he was fully God, and you need to elevate your view of God, that he's not just one of us, he actually was divine at the same time. And so the beauty of the scriptures is that we see both, but here in this passage, we catch a glimpse of his humanity, that the Son does not even know the day or the hour. How can that be? Because Jesus was fully human just like we are, and just as none of us know that day or hour, Jesus in his humanity did not know that day or that hour. Now, in light of this, what Jesus just said, that there is going to be a day where that day of the Lord, the day or the hour, no one knows it, not the Son, not the angels, only the Father. Jesus now, in verse 34 through 37, tells a parable, which is a story, to illustrate this principle that he just taught. He just said, this day of the Lord is sure, he's going to come back, but nobody knows it. And to illustrate that, here's the story that Jesus tells. He says in verse 34, it is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and he commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. So Jesus here is telling his disciples, here's a picture to illustrate what I just said. And he said, this parable, this story is like a man who went on a journey and he left all of his servants to rule over the house. The man going on the journey in the story is Jesus. Jesus was telling his disciples, I'm not going to be with you forever. After Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, he ascended back to the Father. He went on a journey and he left in charge of the earth his disciples as stewards with work to do. And he said, you don't know the day that the master's gonna come back, so be ready. And in this passage, the story that Jesus is using to illustrate this truth, there are two commands that Jesus says for all of us as people, as we see the master's gone away, but we don't know when he's gonna come back. There are two commands for us in this passage. The commands here that Jesus gives, which is what our duty is, our responsibility as stewards of the earth and as followers of Jesus, until he comes back, what are we supposed to do in this in-between time? Two things Jesus says. Number one, work, and number two, watch. And I want to break these down a little bit. We are all called to work, number one, and to watch, number two. Here's what, again, Jesus said in verse 34. It's like a man going on a journey. When he leaves home and he puts his servants in charge, notice this phrase, each with his work, and he commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. This parable, Jesus says, as the master goes away, he has left to every single person a certain type of work. Each is called to his work. Each is to be on guard. Each is to stay awake. Each is to not fall asleep. The question is, what is the work we are supposed to do since the master has left? Since Jesus is in heaven right now, but we know he is going to come back, we don't know when that is. What is the work that we have each been called to do? I will say that there are two aspects to the work we are called to. There is a general work that all Christians are to do, and then there is a specific, unique work and a unique calling that God has placed on individuals' lives. With the general, we do know, according to scriptures, all followers of Jesus, I could boil it down to two things. We're all called to two things. Number one, preaching the gospel, that is sharing the good news of Jesus with people. We looked at this last week. We want to be a church that shares the good news and scatters seeds on all types of soil. That's not just something pastors do. This is something every follower of Jesus is called to do, to share the good news of Jesus. So part of our work is spread the good news. And then number two, to make disciples. This is the Great Commission. Before Jesus, the master, left, he said, go and make disciples of all nations. Baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Teach them to observe all I've commanded you. So if you're here today and you're a follower of Jesus and you're questioning, man, what's the work that I am supposed to be engaging in as I await for the return of the master? I would say this is a great spot to start. Just start with finding the people that God's placed in your life that you could share the gospel with, that you could share the good news with. And if you have somebody in your life who is following Jesus or new to Jesus, or maybe they've been walking with Jesus a long time, but they still just need to continue to grow, to disciple them, which simply means to come alongside somebody and teach them what it looks like to follow Jesus. I think that's a really good starting spot for anyone questioning what's the work we're called to do. We're all called to preach the gospel and to make disciples. Now, apart from that communal calling, the general calling that all Christians have, there is a unique calling and a unique task that God has placed on every individual's life, a unique type of work that we are called to cultivate. You see, when God created human beings in his own image, that means that there is something similar about all of us. We all bear and reflect the image of God. But the image of God also means that we are unique, that there is not any two human beings on this earth who are exactly alike. And so as Jesus says here, the master is left, you're called to work. There are things that we work for and similarly, and then there is a certain type of work that we are uniquely called to, individually called to. And it looks different for every person. As you're saying, God, what's the work I'm individually called to do? What does that look like? I would say start with, what are the relationships that you have? What are the relationships that God has given you to cultivate? My sphere of influence and my circle and my friends and my family, I have influence there in a way that you guys don't. And you guys have influence and spheres of influence and friends and coworkers and family who you get to cultivate a relationship with that I don't. So our work begins with our sphere of influence. God, who have you placed in my life that I can work towards cultivating a relationship with in hopes to be able to share the gospel with them? We also not only have different relationships, we also have different vocations where God has placed us to contribute to the world and to renew culture and to create an environment of human flourishing. And guess what? Your vocation is different from my vocation. Not all of you are called to be a pastor and to stand up and exposit the word, but guess what? I'm not called to make latte art, but I'm glad that there are people who do that. I'm not called to be an accountant, but I'm glad there are people who do that. I'm not called to be a school teacher, but there are people who are called to do that. I'm not called to be a stay-at-home mom, but there are people who are called to do that. Every single person has a unique vocation. And sometimes that's seasonal. It doesn't mean that you're supposed to stick with that your whole life. Sometimes God moves us on, and that's totally fine. But your vocation, which is your work, is part of the work that God has placed you here on the earth to do, to steward what God's given us, to make something out of what God has made, to create culture. So you got to understand that your vocation is for sure connected to the work that God has placed you here on the earth to do. We not only have the different relationships which we can work at, different vocations that we work in, we also have different gifts that God has given to each of us for the advancement of the kingdom of God. It's like Rousseau was sharing, inviting people to serve. Man, this is something that the body is supposed to do. Just because someone's on staff at church, the staff can't do everything. Every person in the body has different gifts that God's given them. And your gifts and the way that God's uniquely wired you and the things he's put in your heart that you're passionate about, pursue those things. Move into those spaces. Allow God to use the gifts that he's given you for the advancement of the kingdom of God. So this is what we're called to do. We are called to work in such a way that every day the relationships I'm cultivating, when I go to work, actually to my vocation, well, like as you're doing that, we are to do everything in such a way that if Jesus actually did come back today, because Jesus says no one knows the day or the hour, if Jesus did come back today, he would find me and the work that I'm doing, and he would say to me, well done, good and faithful servant. That is how we are to conduct our lives. That is how we are conduct our time here on this earth, realizing Jesus could come back at any moment. And if he does, is he going to say, well done, good and faithful servant? Or is he going to say, depart from me, I never knew you? The work is cultivating a relationship with Jesus. It's inviting Jesus into our other relationships. It's inviting him into our vocation. It's inviting him to use the gifts and multiply the gifts and things he's given us for his glory. And so I want to challenge you guys this week to just as you're going about your work, the relationships God's given you, the vocation he's given you, the school you're at, whatever it is, the question for us, which I think is really important, is this. Has your day-to-day work, whatever that is for you, has it become just work? Like, is it just, I'm checking that box, I have to do this, I got to pay the bills. Has it become just work, or is our work actually an act of worship? Are we working in such a way that we're saying, God, I want to do this to bring you glory, not just for me, not just to save up more money so I can go on another vacation or get that next car or that next house or whatever. I want to do my work in such a way that it's an act of worship, that the people I'm working with, the people I'm around would catch a glimpse of Jesus, that the way I'm working and stewarding the time that I have, God, that it would reflect your heart, that it would be in a way that shows the hard work that you, God, did from the beginning in creation. Now I get to steward that as well. Would our work not just be work, but would it be done as an act of worship as we're anticipating and saying, God, I want to be found when you come. Whenever that is, I want to be found doing my work to the best of my ability so that you say, well done, good and faithful servant. So the first thing, again, in this passage, the command is that we're all each called to do the work that God has given you. I want to just encourage you guys, continue to pursue those things God's placed on your heart. And then secondly, we are called not only to work, but also 3 times in this passage, he repeats this phrase, keep awake, which means we're called to work and we're called, number 2, to watch. If we don't know when the master's coming back, we, number 1, better be busy about the kingdom. We should be making the best use of our time in the work God's given us. But also, we need to not fall asleep. He says we need to watch. We need to stay awake. And in the ancient world, when a master would go away on a journey, he would appoint a doorkeeper to watch over his house and to watch over the servants to make sure everything was getting done. And in this culture, it's really interesting. There were actually 4 different watches, and a different doorkeeper would be working different shifts. As he says here in verse 35, if you'll notice, he says, therefore stay awake. You don't know when the master of the house will come, whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or in the morning. Those were the 4 different watches. But if you'll notice here, what's really interesting is that Jesus here is saying that the doorkeeper is supposed to watch at all 4 of those shifts. He's supposed to stay awake and be on watch for the master, whether it is midnight or the rooster's crowing or the morning or the evening. Jesus here is saying that this doorkeeper who I've appointed over my house, He needs to be up and ready and on watching for the coming of the master 24/7. It was different than what actually happened in that culture. And then after Jesus says that this doorkeeper needs to be on watch for all 4 shifts, look what he says in verse 37. He says, what I say to you, his disciples, I say to all, stay awake. So Jesus here says this command to be watching and waiting for the coming of Jesus 24/7, we're to be always awake spiritually, always alert, always ready and anticipating the coming of Jesus. This was not just a command for the disciples then. He says, this is what I say to you all, that all of you are to stay awake. This is something that every single person should be ready for. So what Jesus is saying is that even for all of us, our duty, our responsibility as we're here on this earth and the master has went away is we are to work in such a way that we will be found busy about the master's work when he returns, but also we are to be watchful. And that is 24/7, to be ready and saying, Jesus, we are ready and we are anticipating your coming. We are not spiritually sleeping and drifting off and doing our own thing. We're alert and we're busy about the kingdom work, watching and waiting for your return. This is something that we are all called to do. Now, with this command to watch, stay awake, be alert, there are 2 extreme camps that different Christians can kind of slip into that I think is really important to address. So again, this command to watch just means we are ready and we are busy about the work of the kingdom for whenever Jesus comes. That's what it means. Here's the 2 extremes when this command watch comes into play. There are some Christians who take this command watch and they have this obsession with the end times and this obsession with trying to figure out when it is and the obsession with the return of Jesus. These are people that I would call eschatological enthusiasts. These are people who you would find just love binge watching the news and just figuring out what's happening in culture that we can connect to the fact that maybe proves Jesus is returning. These are people who read the Jerusalem Post probably every single morning. Oh man, look what's happening in Jerusalem. This is a sign that now Jesus is probably coming back today or this week or next month. These are people who interpret the signs and everything happening in culture that make them believe Jesus actually is coming back in our generation. On a Friday night, these would be the type of people who will be at some sort of prophecy update and figuring out and hearing what's going on with the modern state of Israel and hearing how Trump was the Antichrist, but now probably Biden is because there's a new Antichrist every term, basically. And they're like, oh man, like who's the Antichrist now? These are the people who are worried about, oh my gosh, cryptocurrency, one world government, it's predicted. This is a sign Jesus is coming back now. And vaccines for sure are the mark of the beast. We thought it was the iPhone, but now we all have those. So shoot, like it's probably the vaccine, like, right? Like this is eschatological enthusiasts. These are people who the way they're watching is not the way that Jesus said we watch. If you'll notice, which is really interesting, the 2 questions that the disciples asked him concerning the destruction of the temple and then his second coming, around the destruction of the temple, Jesus gave a bunch of signs. He said there's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be famines, there's going to be all sorts of things. But about his second coming, he doesn't give any sort of sign whatsoever. He just says, nobody knows. And so to watch in such a way where we are actually trying to predict and figure out and decode the key to understand that we have the key to decipher the end times and we know when Jesus is coming back, I think that misses the heart of the command to watch. And in fact, what it can do is it can take much of our attention and our speculation on the end times. It can divert our gaze from Christ, and also it can distract us from our duties and the work that we're called to do here and now. This is just what I've seen. Christians who tend to be more obsessed about the end times, they're so end times focused that they're not investing presently in the work that God has placed before them and making disciples and reaching people in their current context. And so to watch is not to predict, it's just to be ready. And so there is one group of Christians on one side who take it to extreme and try to figure out when it's going to happen. And because of those types of Christians, that has turned off so many other Christians that they swing to the other side, which is not healthy either. And there are some Christians who take this command to watch and they're like, you know what? I don't really need to do that at all. Like there are some Christians who actually don't think about the return of Jesus at all. There are some Christians who don't live with any sense of urgency or expectation that Jesus could come back at any moment. And while the first group is at the prophecy update every single week trying to figure it out, the second group is just out partying, just doing their own thing, just living their life, just kind of their motto is like, yeah, we believe in Jesus, but eat, drink, and be merry, like life's great, like let's just make the most of it. And when one becomes unconcerned or inattentive or even skeptical about Jesus' return, the natural byproduct and fruit of that, of not being watchful, is we just fall into rampant hedonism. Our life just becomes so self-consumed. If there is no living present reality that Jesus could come back at any moment, if I'm not watching and living in that type of way and I'm falling into spiritual sleep, my life just becomes about me. And I have no sort of expectation or anticipation for the reality of this. And Peter actually warned the early church about this in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3 and 4. I want to read this real quick because Peter warns these people who have fallen asleep and who are just not even concerned about the idea that Jesus might come back. They're like, well, maybe he will, maybe he won't. We probably don't know, so let's just do our thing. Peter warns these types of people. In 2 Peter 3, verse 3 and 4, he says this, knowing this, first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation. So Peter is saying that there were some people who just say, look, Jesus has promised this. He said he was going to come back, but it's been 2,000 years and everything is just continuing as it was from the beginning. It's life as normal. So let's just do our thing. He's probably not going to come back in our generation. So let's just kind of go about our lives and make sure maybe later in life we have everything figured out. But let's just kind of live it up and do our own thing. And Peter warns us against that type of mindset. So again, when someone loses the sense of watchfulness that Jesus calls all of us to, when someone loses the sense of watching and expectation, they become like the doorkeeper who has fallen asleep. And he says the master could come back at midnight. He could come back in the middle of the night. He could come back in the morning when the rooster crows. So we need to watch and be ready and awaiting the second coming of Jesus any moment of any day. And so again, these two extremes, what we need to understand is that both of them ignore the calling of Jesus to the here and now. Both extremes ignore the here and now that we are called to do our work and be on mission and preach the gospel and make disciples and do that in such a way that we are watching and waiting that our kingdom work is done with a sense of urgency, believing that Jesus actually could come back at any moment. And so again, the question for us, because I do find a lot of Christians kind of on the far ends, the question for you, if that is applicable in any ways, is simply where do you land? Have you become so in times and so futuristic focused that it's actually distracted you from being present and investing in your community and investing in the relationships and investing in the work God's given you now? Or have you become, you're not even thinking about that at all, the reality of Jesus coming, and so you've just been so focused on yourself. You've just been focused on your own life and what you want to do and pursuing your passions and your desires. And I think what we need to understand is that all followers of Jesus are called to, again, these two things, to work and to watch. That my work would be, I would every single day say, God, I'm actively on mission. How do you want to use me? And I'm watching and I'm waiting and saying, Jesus, this could be the day. It could be 2,000 years. It could be 2 weeks. It could be 2 minutes. But God, I'm going to live today and live this moment as if this is all I have. Because the reality is we don't have tomorrow promised. And so Jesus is telling us, let's be a people who is busy about the work of the kingdom, and a people who is living in expectation, anticipating the return of Jesus. And the thing is, again, he doesn't tell us when it is. He doesn't even know when it is. And I think that calls us into a deeper sense of trust. The fact that Jesus doesn't even know, that I don't even know, that only the Father knows, means, God, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust you that you've given me today. You've left me here on this earth for whatever purpose. I want to use the time you've given me and do the work that you've called me to in such a way that I would be found, when you come back, hearing you say, well done, good and faithful servant. So in light of this, this week, our formation challenge, which if you're new here, every week we study the scriptures. Hopefully this is helpful information in part of your discipleship to Jesus. But we like to just put one practical application. How can you actually put this into practice to grow in your awareness of these things we talked about today? The formation challenge for the week is simply this. It's to do your work with a sense of watchfulness. What does that mean? What does that look like? To break it down a little more, simply this. Here's practically what you can do this week to live into this. Before your workday begins, whether you're a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad, or you actually drive to work or you walk to work, before your workday begins, reflect on and remind yourselves of the reality of the imminent return of Jesus. As you're driving to work, as you're walking to work, to just be aware and say, Jesus, this could be the day. I want to be ready for you. I want to be found when you do come back, hearing you say, well done, good and faithful servant. And so today, God, help me to live in awareness of the reality of your second coming. Not speculating and trying to figure it out and only focusing on the future, but God, today, help me to live in the reality of that. I think that as followers of Jesus, if this becomes our mindset, God, as I'm going into work today, as I'm going to school today, as I'm going to invest in my family's relationships today, God, help me to do it with a sense of watchfulness. Help me to work in such a way that I'm anticipating and expecting your return. And if we live this type of way, I think that it really is going to help us cultivate a deeper understanding of who Jesus is and go deeper in our discipleship to Jesus. Amen to that?